There are parts of ourselves we assume are temporary. The confidence we had to practice, the independence we learned out of necessity, the calmness we built because falling apart wasn't an option. We tell ourselves these things are adaptations, ways of getting through a particular season of life. And because of that, we often imagine there's an older version of ourselves waiting underneath them, a version untouched by all the adjustments, untouched by the years spent becoming who we needed to be. But every now and then, a strange realization appears. The thing you once had to practice now feels completely natural. The effort is gone, which raises an uncomfortable question. If something once felt like a performance, but now feels effortless, at what point did it become something else? And if it did, what exactly is it now? Because maybe the unsettling part isn't that we changed. Maybe it's that we can no longer tell where the adaptation ends, and we begin. Most of us don't become who we are all at once. We adjust, gradually, quietly, often without noticing. A child discovers that being funny can ease tension in a room. Someone learns that appearing calm earns them more trust. A person who feels overlooked begins working harder than everyone around them. Someone who gets hurt enough times learns to need less. Not because they sat down and chose a new identity, because certain ways of being seem to work better than others. They reduced friction, created belonging, made life a little easier to navigate. And over time, those adjustments accumulate. That's the part we rarely think about. We tend to imagine adaptation as something unusual, something that happens after a major event, a crisis, a heartbreak, a trauma. But most adaptation is far less dramatic than that. It's the self responding to the world, making small corrections again and again, until those corrections begin to feel natural, which raises an interesting contradiction. We often talk about these adapted versions of ourselves, as though they are somehow less authentic, less real, as though the person we became through experience is merely a response, while the person we were before, it was somehow the original. But that earlier version was shaped too, by temperament, by family, by circumstance, by things they never consciously chose. So why do we instinctively treat one layer of shaping as more real than another? Maybe because one feels inherited and the other feels constructed, but both left their mark, and both became part of the person standing here now. Most adaptations begin as something we notice, a conscious adjustment, a deliberate effort. At first, there's a clear distinction between the person and the strategy. You can feel the effort, you can see the adjustment happening in real time. But something strange happens when a behavior is repeated often enough. The effort begins to disappear, not all at once, gradually, quietly, until one day, the person who used to rehearse difficult conversations in their head no longer does. The words arrive on their own. Someone who once taught themselves not to need too much from other people stops experiencing that restraint as a choice. It's simply how they move through the world. And this is where the question becomes difficult, because once the effort disappears, the line between what was practiced and what simply feels natural becomes harder to find. We often speak about returning to who we really are, as though somewhere beneath all the adjustments, an untouched version of ourselves has been patiently waiting, preserved, unchanged, ready to be recovered. But people don't stay untouched. They accumulate experiences, habits, adjustments, ways of surviving. And over time, the person shaped by those adaptations becomes just as real as the person who existed before them, which creates a strange kind of vertigo. Because if you can no longer find the seam, if you can no longer tell where the adjustment ended and the person began, what exactly would you be returning to? And if the person you became through adaptation is already real, what exactly are you trying to remove? If these reflections help you make a little more sense of your own experience, consider subscribing. There are more conversations like this waiting for you here. This is where the discomfort begins to change shape. Up until now, the question has been whether the adapted self is real, whether the person we became through repetition, somehow counts less than the person we were before it. But that isn't where the confusion lives. The confusion begins when we realize the adaptation isn't fake. It's real. And so was the person who existed before it. Both shape the person standing here now, and neither completely cancels the other. We're comfortable with the idea that experiences shape us. A loss changes us. A relationship changes us. Responsibilities change us. Those transformations feel natural, even inevitable. What feels stranger is the idea that repetition can shape us too, that something practiced often enough can become part of us in exactly the same way. Human beings are altered by what they repeatedly do, which leaves us facing an uncomfortable possibility that the traits we inherited and the traits we practiced into existence may all be standing side by side inside the same person. Not competing, not replacing one another, simply coexisting. And perhaps that's why the question becomes so difficult. Because once both versions feel real, the search for the real one begins to lose its clarity. This is where the situation becomes more complicated. Because sometimes the adaptation survives long after the conditions that created it have disappeared. The person who learned to depend only on themselves eventually finds people they can trust. The person who learned to stay invisible eventually enters a room where being seen is safe. The person who learned to expect disappointment eventually encounters something reliable. And yet, the adaptation remains. Not because it failed, because it worked. For years, it helped them navigate the world. For years, it protected something important. For years, it made sense. Which creates a strange kind of grief. Not the grief of losing something, the grief of no longer needing something that once mattered. Like wearing the right coat in the wrong season. The coat is real. The coat is yours. It kept you warm when you needed warmth. The problem is that the weather changed. Letting go of it doesn't feel like removing a strategy. It feels like altering a piece of yourself. And perhaps that's why change can feel so complicated. Not because we're holding on to something false, but because we're being asked to loosen our grip on something that was once necessary, something that helped shape the person we became, even if the world that required it no longer exists. Perhaps the strangest part of all this is that the world we live in will keep changing. Life has a way of repeating this process. The person we are today is not standing at the end of it. New circumstances will arrive, new responsibilities, new losses, new demands, and each of them will require new adaptations, gradually, quietly, in much the same way the earlier ones did, until one day, they no longer feel new either. And perhaps that's why it can be so difficult to draw a clean line through ourselves. The person we started as, the person life shaped, and the person we're still becoming rarely stay separate for very long. Given enough time, they begin to blend into one another. And what once felt temporary begins to feel like part of who we are.